Good afternoon, guys. Thanks so much for joining us again for another episode of Ask the SCSA. We hope everyone had a wonderful Canada Day long weekend and got a chance to enjoy the sunshine. This week, we're going to be continuing with our reoccurring presentation on the core auditing process. So this week, Steve Waldbauer is presenting on three sections of the audit tool, sections 8 to 10. Before we get into it, just a few housekeeping things though, to touch on quickly. So if you're joining us for the very first time, we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. And if you have any, just put them into that Q&A feature at the bottom of Zoom. As well, we're going to post any relevant links that we discussed today in the chat feature on Zoom. If you're joining us from Facebook, no worries. We do have somebody monitoring Facebook questions, so you can comment there and we will get to those questions as well. And as always, these webinars are available to watch again after the live event on our website, on our Facebook page, as well as on our YouTube channel. So if you've been watching us for a while now, you're likely getting pretty used to seeing these faces. But for any of the new viewers, we'll do a quick round of introductions before we get started. So maybe we'll start with Steve.
Hi, Steve Waldbauer, Safety Advisor in the Regina region. I cover pretty much south of the #1 right now. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Steve. Kieran?
My name's Kieran. I'm an advisor working out of the Saskatoon office. I deal with a few different regions right now, Prince Albert, east and west of Saskatoon, and the Saskatoon greater area.
Awesome. Thanks. And Rick?
Hi, everyone. My name is Rick Rieger. I'm the Senior Safety Advisor, and I'm based out of Regina.
Well, thanks so much, guys. I am Laura Lodge. I am also an advisor out of the Regina office. And I guess without further ado, Steve, take it away on your audit presentation.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, we continue with part 3 of 5 in our audit tool series. The goal of this series is to provide a better understanding of the audit tool and to help clarify what the audit tool is asking for. This week, we'll be going over sections 8 to 10 of the audit tool and what criteria needs to be met in order to meet the core standard. And, okay, bear with me, the computer's thinking here a little bit. All right, if you'd like to follow along with your own copy of the audit tool, simply go to scsaonline.ca. Under the Resources tab, click on Documents, Forms, Legislation. Among many other great resources, you will see options for 3 versions of our audit tool: Self-Audit, Core Internal, and C-Core Internal. Any one of those will work for today's presentation. This week's sections are 8, Training and Communication; 9, Inspections; 10, Investigations and Reporting. Section 8, Training and Communication. 15 questions, 42 possible points. Training comes up almost 100 times in OH&S legislation. I don't want to talk too much about legislation today, but I do want to quickly refer to parts of Section 12, General Duties of Employers, and the start of Section 19, Training of Workers in OH&S legislation. 12C, the duties of an employer at a place of employment include the provision of any information, instruction, training, and supervision that is necessary to protect the health and safety of workers at work. And 19.1, an employer shall ensure that a worker is trained in all matters that are necessary to protect the health and safety of the worker when the worker A, begins work at a place of employment, or B, is moved from one work activity or work site to another that differs with respects to hazards, facilities, or procedures. Training and communication should be an essential part of your safety program. As with any area of a company's program, having trained and knowledgeable staff is key to its success. Let's start with 8.1. Does the employer have a formal orientation program? The company must have a process for providing safety orientation to workers. All key elements of the health and safety management system should be covered in the orientation program. You can see in this example safety training policy that the company listed a variety of methods to train and communicate the safety program with employees. They have safety orientation for newly hired personnel, orientations for subcontractors, job-specific training is mentioned, whether it's at the time of hire or when you're moving locations, safety training for supervisors and management, task and trade specific, weekly toolbox and quarterly safety meetings, specialized safety, and refresher and updated training. 8.2 in the audit tool asks, is orientation mandatory for all personnel before starting work? This is at the top of the list in this example policy. Great, but not quite enough. Auditors are going to look for documentation as well as verify through interviews that this is the case. Orientation records should include, but are not limited to, clerical, supervisory staff, management, workers, and subcontractors. A modified site orientation may be used for subcontractors. 8.3, is there a standardized written orientation form? The formal orientation process must include a standardized format to ensure consistency of the information. In this example, a checklist is used to ensure the key parts of a company's safety program are reviewed. Site-specific and subcontractor orientation forms may and should differ from a new hire orientation. You can see on this orientation checklist, it mentions quite a bit of the key components on there. They have their policies such as hazard assessment, health and safety. They want to make sure they address practices and procedures and critical tasks, company rules with disciplinary actions, PPE, inspections, near-miss reports and investigation, muster points, first aid locations, emergency preparedness, your first aid logbook, your acts and regs locations, harassment policy are all great topics to have in your orientation. 8.4, does the form provide for signatures? The orientation documentation must provide for the signatures of both the student and trainer. If electronic orientations are used, there must be a process or method to verify who the competent trainer that administered it was. 8.5, are mandatory training requirements verified or training provided before starting work? Training records must support the requirements mandated by policy, such as WMIS, TDG, and H2S. Auditors will cross-reference with other documentation, such as hazard assessments, fall protection work plans, and confined space permits, to ensure that only people with proper training are performing the work. Interviews will be part of the verification process to determine if employees are required to provide their qualifications prior to starting their job with the company. 8.6, are training records maintained? This summary sheet shown here is a great way to keep track of this, but remember, the company must have training records on file for all personnel. They may be hard copy, electronic, or a training matrix with supporting certificates. 8.7, is job-specific training provided and documented as required? Training records must show that training is provided for job-specific tasks. This type of training should include procedures and practices. Other job-specific training would be required to use certain equipment or perform certain work. Examples are fall protection, confined space, PME certification, etc. Interviews will be conducted to help verify that employees have correct training for their job tasks. 8.8, does a qualified person conduct job-specific training? Training records must specify who conducted the training. When in-house training is provided, records must verify that the trainer is competent to provide that specific training. An example of this would be your OHC level 1 train the trainer. 8.9, have supervisors received training in workplace inspections and health and safety responsibilities? All supervisors must have taken training specific to their responsibilities as stated in OH&S legislation, as well as the company responsibilities. SCSA's Leadership for Safety Excellence, the LSE, would satisfy this. If other training programs are used, the auditors will verify the content covers all requirements. Auditors will review documentation as well as verify through interviews that supervisors have taken training in their legal responsibilities. Think of your advisors as your boots on the ground for safety. If he/she isn't competent in regards to your safety program and the proper documentation required, how can they effectively communicate this to the people they are supervising? 8.10 is a system in place to measure knowledge and competency. There should be records of tests or exams associated with orientations and job-specific training. Interviews will help determine that employees wrote a test or exam with their orientation and/or training. You can see these two examples here of an orientation quiz that would follow your orientation just to make sure that they actually understood it. As well as there's a competency evaluation sheet here, so you can observe the worker and sign off when you deem him fit to work. Two great competency evaluations. Safety meetings. 8.11 to 8.14 in the audit tool addresses safety meetings. Safety meetings should include all staff. These meetings are separate from other meetings such as Toolbox talks, FLRAs, or OHC meetings. 8.11, does the employer hold scheduled health and safety meetings? Frequency should match what is stated in the policy. 8.12, does senior management participate in health and safety meetings? 8.13, is a prepared agenda followed and are minutes and attendance of the meeting kept? 8.14, does two-way communication exist during these meetings? Safety meetings should be a company-wide opportunity to address one thing, safety. A well-written agenda will help to ensure the meeting stays on track and everyone has a chance to participate, including feeling comfortable in bringing forth any safety concerns. The auditors will be looking at the agendas and minutes to determine a variety of things: content, attendance, participation, frequency, opportunity to communicate. Interviews will be part of the verification process as well. Toolbox talks are another opportunity to train and communicate. They are generally held with the crew on site and used to address hazards, discuss practices and procedures, gain input from other workers, review incidents, etc. So 8.15 in the audit tool asks, are tailgate toolbox meetings held regularly and documented as per policy? Remember the company policy in slide 4 stating weekly toolbox meetings? The auditors will be looking to verify this as well as employee input, content, and attendees. In summary, orientations. Make sure all employees are orientated and don't forget your subcontractors. Training and competency comes in many forms: hands-on, observational, two-way communication, classroom and online training. Meetings. Whether it's crew level or company-wide, don't miss an opportunity to discuss health and safety. Section 9, inspections. 10 questions, 30 possible points. The inspections in this section are an inspection of entire work areas, unsafe conditions, as well as work practices and procedures. Unlike a hazard assessment, inspections are done during work, not before work has started. Too often, workplace inspections are aimed primarily at finding and recording unsafe conditions only. In order for inspections to be effective, they must include the workplace activities, observations of the people working, and the workplace environmental conditions. Inspections are not intended to assess hazards, but to monitor how well controls are working and if they're being used effectively. Inspections are intended to monitor worksite conditions. And while they may identify a hazard missed by the formal hazard assessment process, this is not the primary reason they are conducted. 9.1 and 9.2. is there a written policy for inspections? And does the policy include frequency of inspections? There needs to be a written policy, and this policy must make reference to the frequency of inspections, or how the frequency of inspections will be determined at company facilities and each job site. The frequency of inspections do not necessarily need to be the same for all areas. You can see in this example policy, job sites, yards, and offices all have different frequencies. The active work areas with more hazards require higher inspection frequencies. The auditor will look to determine if the stated frequency is appropriate for the work being performed. 9.3, is the required frequency being met? Conducting regular workplace inspections are an essential component of the prevention program. The auditors will look at inspection records to determine if all worksite and company facilities inspections are being done as stated in the inspection policy. 9.4, is there a form or checklist used for inspections? The auditors will look to see if a standard format for site inspections is used. 9.5 and 9.6, are supervisors performing inspections as required, and are workers involved in the inspection process? Inspection reports must indicate the names of supervisors and workers that are involved in conducting the inspection. Interviews will also be used to verify the involvement of workers and supervisors. 9.7, are all areas inspected as required? The auditor will be checking to see that areas such as yards, offices, basements, storage facilities, etc. are not being excluded from the inspection process. 9.8, are identified deficiencies corrected in a timely manner? Record all items observed in the inspection reports. Corrective action should be taken as soon as possible on any deficiencies noted in the inspections. Follow up to ensure corrective actions have been implemented and are effective. Records must indicate when corrective actions has been taken, including date, time, and signature. The auditor must determine if corrections are timely based on the potential to cause injury or serious property damage. Interviews will also be used to help verify that employees know that deficient items noted during inspections are corrected in a timely manner. 9.9, does senior management participate, review the inspection process? Senior management must review, date, and sign inspection reports and occasionally participate in the inspections. The site supervisor would typically report to this level of management. Interviews will be used to verify that employees know that senior management is involved in conducting formal site inspections as well as reviews and signs inspection reports. 9.10, are inspection reports posted and/or communicated to appropriate personnel? Inspection reports must be posted or communicated to workers through meetings. Interviews will help verify that workers know how inspection report results are communicated to them. Have an effective communication strategy. Post the inspection results and review with employees and subcontractors at Toolbox and safety meetings. Summary of inspections. During work, not before. Inspections should be done while workers are working. Include all applicable locations such as office, shops, sites, and yards. Inspections are intended to monitor and identify if there are unsafe actions, work methods, or conditions occurring. Part of the inspection process is to monitor how effective the elements of the safety program are working, such as safe work practices and job procedures. Inspections should be conducted while employees are engaging in work during regular work hours. A workplace inspection is used by a group of 2 to 3 people, ideally made up of workers and a supervisor, to assess the job site and to ensure workers are following practices, procedures, controlling hazards, and to look for potential deficient items that people may have overlooked. Section 10. investigations and reporting. 10 questions, 30 points. 10.1. Is there a written investigation policy and reporting procedures? As you can see in this example, the policy addresses incident types, reporting, legislation, near misses, and responsibilities. There's also a written procedure to follow should an accident occur. Item 4 in this sample policy refers to sections 8 and 9 of the OH&S regulations. Accidents causing serious bodily injury and dangerous occurrence are good topics for toolbox and safety meetings to help workers understand their reporting duties. 10.2, is the policy being followed? Incidents must be investigated. The auditors will be looking for verification such as incident and near misses reports. 10.3, are standardized forms readily available and used? Incident reports must be on a standard form designed for that purpose. I'd just like everyone to take note of the size and detail difference between a near miss report and a full investigation report, which is why we really promote getting those near misses in and avoid it getting any bigger. 10.4, do workers know the reporting procedures? Interviews will be used to determine that all personnel are aware of the types of incidences that are required to report. 10.5, have supervisors been trained in investigating and reporting procedures? All supervisors must have taken training specific to their responsibilities for conducting investigations. SCSA's Leadership for Safety Excellence, OH&S Better Supervision, and OHC Level 2 would satisfy this. If in-house training is used, the auditors will need to verify the content. Auditors will also use interviews to help verify that all supervisors have taken training specific to these responsibilities. 10.6, are appropriate personnel involved in investigations? The auditor will check records to ensure that management, as well as workers, or the workers' representatives committee, are involved in the investigation process. The investigation report form should clearly show who the investigation was conducted by. 10.7, are near misses being reported? Near misses must be reported. Near misses of a less serious nature may be reported and discussed at safety meetings. Incidents that have the potential to cause serious injury or property damage must be investigated. There needs to be sufficient records to support that near misses are being reported. The auditors will look to verify through interviews that employees are familiar with a reported and documented near miss. Don't make your near miss be someone else's misfortune. 10.8, are recommendations for prevention remedial action implemented in a timely manner? Reports must indicate details around corrective action, including date, time, and signature. The auditor will look to determine if corrective action is timely based on the potential to cause serious injury or property damage. Corrective actions must be specific to how reoccurrence will be prevented. As well, clearly show when the stated items have been completed. Interviews will help the auditor determine how corrective actions are implemented. 10.9, are remedial corrective actions communicated to the workers? Auditors will look to verify through interviews that workers are aware of incidents that have occurred and what have been done to prevent them from happening again. 10.10, are investigation reports reviewed by senior management? All investigation reports must be reviewed, dated, and signed by senior management. In summary, keep in mind the importance of reporting incidences. It is imperative to be as proactive as possible with your company's health and safety program. Much can be learned and implemented from recording and investigating all incidences, including near misses. That includes sections 8 to 10. Next sections to cover will be 11, emergency preparedness, 12, statistics and records, and 13, legislation. And remember, through the core certification process, Advisory Services is here to help towards a successful audit. Advisory Services can assist with things like safety manual development, form development, training analysis, program implementation, pre-audit checks, remote audit, FTP assistance. Thank you for listening to the presentation today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steve. That was a really good presentation. I know that these the audits can be quite overwhelming, and that's why we've broken it up here to help everyone sort of understand all the details behind each question and guidelines as far as what the auditor is actually looking for. So my questions are just loading here. Just give me another minute.
While you're, we're waiting here, just a reminder that this was 8 to 10. YouTube and Facebook have all the other ones. There's also, when we're talking remote auditing and stuff like that, there's some great presentations on that too. And if you want a lighter one, I was actually down in my region in the RM of Wood River when that tornado touched down. So it kind of reminded me that, you know, Kieran was on that panel when we were doing summer safety and stuff like that. So always good to be prepared, not just on the construction side of things, but you know, whether it's roads or storms. And emergency preparedness is one of the next topics coming up in the next audit thing.
Absolutely. Sorry.
Yeah, that's just it. Yeah. So when we talk about safety, we don't want to talk about it just so it stops at work. Like, the intent is you can take some of these things home. Potentially the audit's a little bit hard to take home, as you're not going to audit your household or anything like that, but taking simple tips about inspections and stuff and taking it to work. And then when you go home at the end of the day, just looking around and assessing potentially what you're doing in your house. So we don't want to preach formal things for every situation, but something from every safety topic can be taken home, taken to the job site, and will help you in all those situations.
Absolutely. Actually, one of the things I always mention to clients and companies is, you know, like hazard assessments, it's something you're probably doing all the time, right? You do it at home, you do it with your kids, you do it when you're boating, right? You think about what could go wrong and what you're going to do to stop that. So
For sure.
I think people don't realize they do it as often as they do. And it's just like you said, Kieran, formalizing it at work, right?
Yeah, it's just stopping and thinking about what you're going to do next.
Yeah.
Assessing the hazards isn't sitting there and looking at the same sheet and saying, oh, we're doing the exact same task as yesterday. Because if we did that every day, we'd be so complacent by the end of the 7th day that we wouldn't understand the hazards, and we might as well have not filled the sheet in anyways. So if we stop and think, there's always going to be something different. Nothing's always the same.
Yeah, and you know, that's exactly it. And then even the forms that we're talking about, you know, when we're talking about safety meetings or toolbox meetings, we're not just trying to get you to fill out more paperwork. We just want you to think of safety at different levels, because you're going to have a toolbox meeting, you know, generally right on site to address, you know, the hazard assessments maybe you've had all week, or just upcoming projects and practices and procedures. That safety meeting is that's when everybody gets together, you know, whether it's your office staff or your work staff, and you kind of get on board and address the whole safety manual. So they are different. Again, it's like the inspections that we were talking about. They don't have to happen at the same frequencies. You're going to have your crew toolbox meetings more often than you're going to have like a full-on safety meeting. So it's just a matter of making sure that all parts of your company and the topics are brought up, and different opportunities to bring that up, and remind you guys where that stuff is, right? You know, like, how do you report and all that. So every time you're doing a meeting, just think of, like, you know, what do my guys maybe not fully understand, and address those at those times.
Yeah. And the best part about all this is that, you know, with CORE, like you guys, the company decides what works for them, right? How often they're going to do things, who's going to be there for certain things. So, you know, it's you guys get to set it up and decide what's of value to you and what works for you and what doesn't, and make it your own. We definitely don't tell you what you need to be doing. We tell you what the guidelines are and what industry standards are, but the companies get to decide that. So just to sort of jump into the questions here, Steve, you mentioned in the presentation something about in-house training for supervisors. So I guess this person's asking a little bit about, just to sort of expand on that. So you can train in-house, or what would an auditor look for if they were going to be doing in-house supervisor training?
Well, I would think that when you're thinking of training, like if somebody on your staff is training others in your staff, they need to be competent in what they're talking about, and you know, it can't be in all avenues of it, but there are you definitely want somebody competent training other ones. So I had mentioned that OHC train the trainer, and like there are train the trainer programs that they can take, so they can be trained to be competent in other divisions. And that doesn't mean you have to take a full-on classroom training to teach somebody how to inspect a saw or something like that, right? It really depends on the situation that you're in. So some in-house training could be as simply as like a new hire, giving them an orientation. That's a form of in-house training. It should be by someone that's competent in the orientations and competent in your safety program, right? It shouldn't be another new guy giving a new guy that piece of paper and saying, here, fill this out. And some require an actual certification saying that you are a trainer of this and you are competent in training that. So depending on what you're training them in, it requires different levels of competency.
Awesome.
If I could just add to that one too, Steve and Laura, what makes sense and what I've seen happen before in the past is sometimes if companies will be providing their own in-house training when it comes to supervisor training, they'll provide that information or their curriculum or whatever it is that they're doing for the training to the advisors prior to the audit. And they'll say, hey, Rick, can you take a look at what we're providing our employees as far as the training here? So what we'll do, and sometimes I've even gone to auditors as well and just had them take a look at it too to make sure, is this quite in line with what we're teaching, say in LSC? So if it is very much in line where the content is very similar, and I've seen companies where it's almost identical as far as what the sections are, as far as what they're training compared to the LSC. So for that situation with that particular company, they were doing what they needed and had in place what they needed to count for that supervisory training for their supervisors. So if companies can be proactive about it and bring that to us ahead of time, we can take a look at them, we can give them some assistance and direction, and like I said, if it even needs to be going to an auditor and getting their opinion too, and just bouncing it off them and seeing what they think, and just providing them with some assistance and some feedback so they're successful when it comes time for the audit. And then there's just not as much surprises, because if a company has any hesitation or they're unsure, waiting until the audit occurs isn't the time to do it. If they can come to us beforehand and be proactive in it, they're just that much better off.
Absolutely. So the other thing I would stress with that, like you said, Rick, is just talking to the advisors. If you don't have one, we can get you in touch with one right away. And running little pieces of your program by them as you lead up to this audit, and they'll be able to help you and make sure that it does meet that standard, that you're going to be successful. So we'll jump into the next one here. So should I be reviewing my safe job procedures and safe work practices at Toolbox and safety meetings?
That's likely the best course of action. It's a time when you're going to get several employees together to get their honest opinions on the different facets of what might be included in those procedures. So if you're talking about what they're going to do for the day, potentially, they might change that procedure in the future, or write a job hazard analysis is what it's called, is forming a step-by-step plan on how to do that job. So reviewing it at those meetings gives employee input and doesn't have it potentially in a format where they're not going to listen or care about the job. Because if they have input, they're probably going to care more and be more efficient.
That's a really good point, Kieran.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you know, that toolbox talk, and, you know, a great thing to think about is what you're doing that week, or, you know, that particular day or whatever. And that's a great way to kind of come up with the ones you're going to review, because you don't have to review every job procedure all the time. And then if you think about what you're doing that day and you're flipping through, you know, sometimes you're going to find that you don't even have a procedure on that. And if that happens, you know, invite your workers to help you do that, because the guys doing these jobs are the ones that are going to have a really good idea of this step by step, right? Managers should look at it. Let's all make sure that this is the right, safe procedure to do this job or practice. But when you review these, like Kieran said, you know, like you can say them at a toolbox meeting, but invite them to give you input back and say, you know what, like, so a worker can listen to it, and instead of just thinking in his head, like, oh, that doesn't work, but not saying anything, you want to invite them to give positive criticism and opportunity to maybe change that policy if it doesn't work on that particular job site. Maybe it worked on one, maybe it didn't work on the other, but and then it also reminds them where they can find these. If they just want a better, for new people, they just want a better idea how something's done. Oh, geez, yeah, we got that safety manual that has that procedure in it. I'm actually going to review this and make sure I'm doing it correctly. So,
Yeah, I guess we can't stress enough how important it is to involve everybody in the safety program, right? It's not just about writing it, especially by someone who doesn't do the work itself and then putting it on a shelf to collect dust, right? We want to involve the workers in it because, like you said, they respect it more, they might be more involved, you know, if they actually have input in that and they're not just kind of being handed something.
and just to go back to the audit tool that we're just discussing, you know, if you watch the previous ones, that's one of the questions. Are you reviewing your practices and procedures, right? So it's straight out of the book. Like, not only do you want to do it, you know, it's right in there to do it. So
yeah. So the next person here is asking, how do I know what should be included in my orientation process for the workers?
Well, oh, sorry, Kieran. Again, this kind of is related to what you were talking about, Laura, when you were saying it's up to the company to determine what it is that you know, that they have in place for their health and safety program, much like it's the same for them to determine what's included in their orientation. So Steve, when he was doing the presentation there, he had a sample list of orientations. And again, advisors can help companies with that, but the companies need to take ownership in their program and make sure that their orientation covers what needs to be covered. So there's some of the basics always, as far as like emergency preparedness and responses, contacts. There's so many things like company rules, different policies, anything that you feel is important and that the workers need to know, that should be included in their orientation. And even to take it a step farther, I know we were talking a little bit about practices and procedures here. I've gone into companies and done audits with companies or for companies where it's one thing to have the practices and procedures, and that's very important that they have them written and that they review them. But even to take it a step farther, you'll sometimes come into companies where they'll have very specialized pieces of equipment or machinery, or even what they do is specialized, and they don't necessarily have formal training when it comes to trades for that. I'm just thinking, like off the top of my head here, like hydrovacing, for instance, it's not necessarily a trade, but it's a very specialized piece of machinery and equipment that people need to be very particular with how they do that. And so I've seen companies where they'll have practices and procedures for that, but not a real formalized and structured training program where that's very job specific. So they should be doing those practical demonstrations and have some documentation, some written documentation as to what did they have in place to train those workers properly, and did they actually see them do what they were supposed to do Do they have the documentation to show that? So say, for instance, if anything happens, if there's an investigation, and Steve's presentation went into the investigation part of it too, what kind of training did these people have? Was it just a quick review of the practices and procedures, or did they have a more detailed training program in place to show these guys and have them trained properly on how to do these specific tasks? So quite often what we'll see when we do these audits is there will be the fall protection, confined space, PME training. A lot of companies will have those things in place because they can send out of house and have that done, or maybe they even do it in-house, but sometimes they're missing some of the bigger pieces of equipment or machinery, or just specialized tools that they use where there could be safety issues if those workers aren't trained properly in those procedures, and just making sure that their staff are properly trained. So I know I went a little bit off on training there, but when it comes to orientations, you need to be proactive in that, and you need to think ahead and not just overlook some of the smaller things too that you think are taken for granted. And I don't mean to diminish it by saying smaller things, but again, even muster points. Sometimes I've gone into companies, and one time in particular where there was 2 guys working in a building, and when it came time for the interview portion of it, asking them where the muster point is, and two different people, they were the only ones on site, gave me 2 different muster points. So it was just something that slipped between the cracks that wasn't discussed, and was probably thought that, well, this is where we muster. The other guy thought this is where we muster, and they didn't have the same idea. So I can't stress enough the importance of having a proper orientation and making sure that you pay attention to those details.
You ended with muster points there, Rick, and that was actually, I touched in my presentation on the training of workers in legislation. If I were to read even one more sentence of that, it would be the training required by that first subsection is procedures to be taken in the event of a fire or an emergency, right? So there's that training of workers, 19.1 in the Ledge book, is tells you a lot about what you should be training in. And like I said, training comes up almost 100 times in Ledge. So it's an important part to your safety. So I invite you to definitely take a look at the training of workers and your duties as an employer in the book.
Yeah, and communication is so important, and just having a blanket orientation isn't necessarily the best idea either. If you have, and maybe you touch on this too, Steve, I think you did in your presentation, when it comes to subcontractors, that orientation will be different than regular workers. Then you get into site-specific orientations where it's different from site to site. So a lot of things to consider and take into account when developing that orientation.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Sorry, we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm kind of trying to float between the two here. So we will jump out of the orientation side here. And now this attendee is asking about, so they've previously worked for companies that did daily or weekly toolbox meetings. And now they've started their own company. They have just a few workers, and do they need to be doing weekly toolbox meetings? What is the mandatory frequency? And we talked about this a little bit earlier. Maybe Kieran, since you've been so quiet, you can expand on that.
With CORE, we don't have a minimum standard. It's just, I don't want to say opinion, but based on the company size, the amount of workers, how much work you're doing, what the work is changing, what you do for other documentation, how often your other safety meetings are. So it really depends. If you're a company of 5 people and you're on the job all the time, maybe you do an informal meeting every day. It depends. When you start the job and you do your risk assessment, chances are you're going to talk about what you're going to do today, how you're going to do it, who's going to do what, the supervisor is going to delegate stuff. So what you really want to be sure of is that the frequency you have is enough to support the things you want to tell your guys. So if you have 100 procedures, probably beneficial to have it weekly. That way you can get the different procedures across potentially as you're doing them. Or if you're a smaller company that does one thing all the time, it may be more appropriate to have a less frequent toolbox meeting.
Absolutely. And I mean, like I mentioned before, and like Kieran stated, we don't have any mandatory frequencies for anything, I don't believe. So it's up to the company to decide what works for them, right? Now that being said, you know, what works for them, I've, you know, had people be like, well, we're going to do it once a year. And that's just not reasonable, right? Considering maybe what you do for work or what the hazards are or anything, right? So make sure it's reasonable. Like Kieran said, make sure that, you know, you're doing it often enough where you're able to pass on the necessary information. But not so much that people stop attending or they stop listening or whatever, right? They become complacent to it because it's happening so often. So it's always an individual case-by-case thing, but advisory services can help with that as well, right? They can look at what you're doing, how many people you have, the information you need to share, and help you come up with a frequency that works for you. So the next question is actually on subcontractors. My workers receive site-specific orientations from the prime contractor on site. Do I need a copy of this orientation?
I guess it depends on the context and how they're looking at it. Like, if the prime is keeping them, as long as there's a record of it, that should be fine in a way. However, that being said, when we're coming in and auditing companies, that's what I'm saying. It just kind of would be good to know the context of it. That's often a problem with documentation collection, that like the general or the prime, they're the ones that keep the documentation. Then if a company is having an audit, they have a hard time getting copies of that documentation. We see that lots, especially like in the oil and gas, like sometimes with non-member companies that are doing the audits through us too. That seems to be kind of an issue with them quite often. Or working for some of the crown corporations, getting that documentation, it's somewhat secure and they don't have access to that. So that being said, if that company is being audited, the auditor is always looking for that documentation. So sometimes even when it comes to now electronic versions and things like that, it's a lot easier to keep copies or make copies of that and keep that organized. So it's not necessarily a one size fits all or a black and white answer to that question.
And yeah, and just to add to that, like if you're a subcontractor working for somebody bigger and you're doing their orientation, that would be site specific as well. So I still invite you to have a company orientation, because you still want to have people in your company know about your safety program. It's not just about the one you're buying into at this particular job site, which is good if it's better than yours or just as good as yours, and that's the requirement, because you're all going to want to follow the same muster point at that specific job site. But in your overall company, like your new hire and that sort of stuff, that's going to be a different orientation anyways, because you're going to have different job sites and you're going to have a different manual and different duties beyond that one site specific.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Steve. It's, yeah, like for core, if a company only had an orientation done at the site that they were subcontracting off of, that wouldn't meet the standard. You still need to orientate to your own company. And as far as the audit goes, I would say, like, in this instance, if you're having an audit happen and you have documentation that belongs to the prime contractor, I would say for the audit purposes, like if that's one of the sites that is going to be audited or included in the audit, then get the documentation for that site, right? You don't necessarily need to have it for every single site, but for the audit, for what's being audited, it would be good to have that documentation if you can get it.
Yeah, like even with, I've seen where companies will be working at mines, and when we're trying to take a look even for records of their emergency evacuation drills, sometimes it's pretty difficult for them to get records of it when the site will do the drill. Like, so they'll do the emergency response drill, but then they'll keep records, they'll have that documentation, keep the records of that. So then when we're auditing a company, they sometimes may be on a site for a very long period of time. They've been involved in that, in emergency evacuation drills, but it's pretty difficult for them to come up with that documentation because it's, you know, the general contractor, prime contractor, whoever that's, or it'll be like the mine that does these evacuation drills at certain specified times. So I have had some companies where they're like, oh yeah, I know so-and-so, I'll send them a quick email. Is that going to suffice? And it's like, well, it depends on the quality of that email and what's all included in that. And so I have had companies that have requested that, and one in particular where he got a record of that documentation back fairly quickly, which ended up working for them. But quite often that's not the case. It's difficult to retrieve documentation at times from companies.
Yeah. And it's something to think about well in advance of the audit. And that's why we often have advisors contacting companies previous to their audit, even if they don't have an assigned advisor, to catch things like that, right? To make sure that everything's ready for the audit. So you guys aren't losing points unnecessarily. So, okay, we got a few more minutes left and a few more questions. So I'll try and get to all of them. Our company has an investigation team of supervisors and management. Will we lose marks for not including a worker in the investigation process? It's a really good question.
I'd have to just look at the audit question specifically here, but I know that they are looking for like appropriate members as far as OHC members.
I believe it's 10.6 that talks, section 10.6, Rick, that talks about the training workers.
Okay.
Just to make sure we get the correct one here.
Yeah, if I were to look at 10.6, it's our appropriate personnel involved in investigations. And then this is straight out of the audit toolbook. It said the auditor will check to ensure that management as well as workers or the workers' representatives are involved in the investigation process. So
there you go.
Including the workers from the committee, I think is what it has in brackets there too. So it is looking for appropriate members or appropriate, for the appropriate people to be included in that.
Awesome. As well, just to note, anybody who is involved in an investigation should have training, whether they're a worker or a supervisor, in how to conduct an investigation and carry it out. So we have a couple more. How do I know if something should be reported as a near miss or as an incident?
It depends on if the incident causes damage, injury to a person, damage to a property. So a near miss is more like something that almost happened. If you drop something heavy right beside your foot and you weren't wearing steel toes, or even if you were, it still could be a near miss. Now, if you drop that straight on your toes, broke your foot, that's an incident. So the definition,
It all depends on the outcome, I guess, hey?
Yeah.
So,
I guess just to go a little further into that though, like whether it happened or it didn't can be considered an incident. This is where like sections 8 and 9 in your legislation, you know, you could talk about dangerous occurrences. If it was a near miss and nothing happened, but it could have been devastating, that's reportable as well. You know, that's, so definitely to bring that up. So when you think about in terms of incident can be something that did happen or could happen. An accident, it happened. A near miss almost happened. An incident falls into that gray area of it could be either. And again, sections 8 and 9 do cover those items in the book.
absolutely. Okay. And how can I show that I have trained my workers on specific tools or pieces of equipment?
Actually, that was in the presentation. There was a competency evaluation form. Again, it depends. Like, I mean, if you're talking about equipment, you're going to want to send them for actual certification. You can definitely observe them on site, which will be part of it, because that is always part of the policy. You don't want somebody that said they were competent, it turns out, oh geez, you know, that guy told me he was a journeyman and been in the business for 10 years, and then it turns out, you know, he just wasn't as qualified as he said. So observation is key. Documenting that observation is also key to show that you actually watch them perform that task. So, you know, if you're just want to see that a guy can use a saw, or you're just training him for the first time, you know, it might take different levels. One guy is going to say he's used it a bunch. You watch him do it. You go, oh, yeah, this guy knows what he's doing. Done and done, right? Or there's the brand new guy that, you know, he's been hauling all your stuff. Now it's time to run the saw. So you're going to watch him do it. And then you're going to see that he's a little bit uncomfortable, and you're going to, you know, correct him on his mistakes, and you're going to probably observe him again and until you deem him competent, and you know, a simple piece of paper to show that you did that. So we do have that a form for that very thing, but yeah, again, depending on your what they're being trained in, different levels of paperwork required.
Yeah, and it's like anything on this and that we've said throughout all of this is it's all like case by case, right? So for small hand tools like saws or drills or anything like that, you might mention the training on your hazard assessment or on your toolbox meeting that morning, that you went over that sort of stuff with the guys or went over the procedure with them. On larger pieces of equipment like excavators and dozers and stuff like that, the legislation actually requires 16 hours of documented training. So that documentation is going to be a little bit more formal. They have to have in class as well as practical experience. So again, it's case by case. It depends on what you're training them on. But like Kieran and Steve have both said, it's all about documentation, right? How are we documenting what they're capable of doing, and just keeping record of that for the audit. All right, guys. Well, we're actually right at the end of our webinar. It goes so fast. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for all the really good questions. So next week, we're going to be going over sections 11 through 13 of the audit tool. So join us for that if you can. And if you can't make the time, it's again noon next Tuesday. These again are recorded. They're on YouTube, on Facebook, and on our website. So you can check them out later at your convenience. For now, all the best. Stay safe, stay home, and stay healthy.